They say nothing can keep good people apart forever, but we all know that's just a lie. And if there's one thing Shakespeare's been trying to tell us for centuries, it's that sometimes being in love is an even worse fate than dying. So get ready to have your mind blown, because today I am gonna now show you why Romeo and Juliet is you and a sweet love story you've ever been told it is. Welcome to my channel. Today we'll be answering the question, what if Romeo and Juliet were actually a cautionary tale? First, let's look at where Shakespeare got his inspiration. There is a reason why Romeo and Juliet has endured through the ages, and that is because it is based on a true story. Well, not exactly the story we all know and love, but it's close. In 1325, two Italian families, the Montecchi and the Cappelletti, started having problems. Like any dysfunctional family, they just couldn't seem to get along. They got into so many fights that the entire city of Verona became involved. Finally, the ruler stepped in and decided enough was enough. He put the men under house arrest and forbade them from leaving until things had calmed down. But as soon as the men were locked up, two young lovers named Romeo Montague and Juliet Capulet snuck off and got married in secret. Unfortunately, their happiness didn't last long. Shortly after their wedding, Romeo's hot-headed friend Tybalt got into a fight with Juliet's cousin. Things got heated, and in a moment of anger, Romeo stopped Tybalt's attack with his sword, killing him instantly. For this crime, Romeo was banished from Verona. Heartbroken, he went to live in exile in Meanwhile, back in Verona, Juliet's father had found out about her secret marriage to Romeo and was furious. To punish her for disobeying, he ordered that she marry a man named Paris. Desperate to avoid the union, Juliet turned to Friar Lawrence for help. He gave her a sleeping potion which would make her appear dead for 42 hours. Then he sent a letter to Romeo explaining the plan. But for some reason, the letter never arrived. When Romeo heard about Juliet's supposed death, he immediately bought poison and returned to Verona to be with his beloved. He crept into her tomb, drank the poison, and died before Juliet woke up. Upon discovering Romeo's lifeless body next to her, she took his dagger and ended her own life. As you can see, the original story is pretty similar to Shakespeare's play, but there are some key differences. For example, in the original tale, Romeo wasn't banished from Verona, but he did leave voluntarily, because he felt guilty over killing Also, Juliet wasn't given a sleeping potion. Instead, she simply drank a vial of strong wine. But overall, the plot is basically the same, and it is clear that Shakespeare used the tale of Romeo and Juliet as the basis for his play. But why did he choose this particular story? It's simple. Shakespeare was a businessman, and this was the hottest story in town. Feuds between families were common in Elizabethan England, and Shakespeare knew his audience would be interested in hearing about a forbidden romance between two star-crossed lovers. But what Shakespeare did not count on was how much his audience would fall in love with the characters. Nowadays, people see Romeo and Juliet as the ultimate love story. But if Shakespeare had written the play today, nobody would have seen it. That's because back then, Romeo and Juliet weren't teenagers. They were adults. And if they were going to elope, they needed to be married by a priest, not a friar. You may be wondering, what's the big deal? Who cares if Romeo and Juliet weren't teenagers? Well, me, for one. If Shakespeare had written Romeo and Juliet as adults, we wouldn't have fallen for it. The whole play is based around the idea of young, innocent love. If they were old enough to understand the consequences of their actions, then the play wouldn't be nearly as effective. Shakespeare purposely wrote Romeo and Juliet as teenagers to emphasize the player's main theme. Blind passion leads to destruction. Sure, the love between the two is passionate, but it's also impulsive and reckless. They meet for the first time at a party, and by the end of the night, they're in love. Then they decide to get married without telling anyone. And when they face any obstacles, they don't try to work around them. Instead, they take the easy way out. Romeo is banished, and Juliet is willing to marry another man. If either one of them had waited a day, everything would have been different. But that's the whole point of the story. Shakespeare wanted to show how destructive blind passion can be. So now that we've established that Romeo and Juliet isn't a romance, let's look at some of the other disturbing secrets in the play. When we think of Romeo and Juliet, we tend to focus on their romance, but if we really pay attention, we'll see that the play is really about manipulation. Let me explain. From the moment Romeo sees Juliet at the Capulets' party, he's completely under her spell. He doesn't care that she's a Capulet. He doesn't care about the feud. All he cares about is that he wants to marry her. And it doesn't take long for Juliet to realize this. She knows Romeo is head over heels for her, and she uses this to her advantage. When her father tells her she has to marry Paris, she refuses and says she never marry anyone except Romeo. Of course, Romeo falls for it. He thinks Juliet is the most beautiful woman in the world, and he would do anything to be with her. But what about Juliet? Does she really love Romeo, or was she just playing him? We'll never know for sure, but I think it's safe to say that she enjoyed the attention. After all, she spends a lot of time flirting with Romeo, even though she knows their relationship is forbidden. In fact, I'd argue that Juliet is just as responsible for the play's tragic ending as Romeo. Just think about it. If she hadn't played hard to get, Romeo might not have been so determined to win her over. And if she hadn't gotten so angry at her father, she might have agreed to marry Paris. That doesn't mean Juliet is a bad person. Shakespeare purposely wrote her as a strong-willed character who was unafraid to stand up for what she believed in. But it does mean that she is not the perfect romantic figure we've made her out to be. In fact, I'd argue that Shakespeare was making a commentary on how women are often objectified by men. Just think about it. Romeo is instantly infatuated with Juliet, and he spends the entire play trying to win her over. But what does Juliet do? She plays hard to get and makes him work extra hard for her affection. In the end, Romeo is so obsessed with winning Juliet over that he doesn't have to even care if she loves him back. He just wants to be close to her. But Romeo and Juliet aren't the only ones to blame for the play's tragic ending. Shakespeare was also making a commentary on society at the time. Back in Elizabethan England, there was a lot of pressure to conform to societal norms. If you were a young man, you were expected to get married and have children. And if you were a young woman, you were expected to be submissive and obedient. If you didn't follow these rules, you were considered a threat to society. And believe it or not, this is one of the reasons why Romeo and Juliet ended up dying. Think about it. Romeo and Juliet didn't have to elope. They could have easily waited a few years and married within their own social class. But they didn't. They chose to go against society's expectations and do what they wanted. And for that, they paid the ultimate price. But the most disturbing part of the story is that it's still relevant today. Even though Romeo and Juliet is a 400-year-old play, it's still being performed all over the world. And that's because the story is still relevant today. We still live in a society where people are judged by their families and their social status, and sometimes that means sacrificing your own happiness for the sake of others. But is that really what Romeo and Juliet were doing? I don't think so. I think they were selfish and irresponsible, but they were also in love. And no matter what, their love story will live on in the hearts and minds of audiences everywhere. Now check out, what if Romeo and Juliet were a musical? Or click this other video instead.